I am here with Raleigh Halverson and Garrett Holzer to continue our conversation about Chaoskampf, which we had, a month ago?
Something like that.
So, refresher on Chaoskampf real quick, in case anybody missed the first part. Basically, what it means is like chaos struggle. That's what it translates to in English, like battle. And you can see a running theme through virtually all mythology of order being brought into the universe through a climactic struggle against chaos or an embodiment of chaos. And this is relevant to us because, first, there's obvious references to it in, say, like the book of Job, chapter 41, where God is talking to Job about Leviathan and defeating Leviathan and Behemoth. And then there are more symbolic meanings to it, which is what Raleigh's going to be talking to us about, getting in Genesis.
We talked last week about Genesis. Last time we talked about Genesis, and we already kind of introduced it, but I'll give a little bit of a refresher on what we said. In Genesis, unlike the creation myths of old, we have no great beast that needs to be slain, no great battle that needs to be won, but rather God just arrives at the chaotic, watery mass, so to speak, which there's no struggle. God doesn't have to fight it or defeat a monster or something. He just speaks and controls it, right? Which shows the God that the Israelites are putting forward to be greater than the gods of the ancient Near East. Because the gods of the ancient Near East had to struggle with the chaos, as where Yahweh has no struggle, right? He just comes and speaks and does and creates order out of chaos. The chaos theme is still there, but the battle is virtually non-existent. Whereas in the ancient Near East, as we talked about, every creation myth is filled with a struggle of some description, a Chaoskampf, a struggle, a battle or struggle with chaos, where it has to be overcome in order for the gods to create an ordered realm. As where the chaos is there and God just uses it and creates order out of it, and there's no battle at all. So Genesis 1 sort of, in some respects, demythologizes the whole thing.
And it makes it much more straightforward. And that's part of why I was surprised when you mentioned that Chaoskampf seems to go much deeper into Christianity than the little bit that I had noticed, because Genesis 1 does not read like a Chaoskampf story at all. It is almost pure logos. You use the word to speak existence into being.
Well,
create order that way.
Here's the problem. Really, what Genesis 1 is in the ancient Near Eastern background is it's not creation ex nihilo like Christians believe in, and I believe in creation ex nihilo, by the way. I'm not speaking against creation ex nihilo, which is creation out of nothing. But Genesis 1 isn't about creation out of nothing. Genesis 1 is about God ordering the cosmos that's already there. The cosmos is there. And he's ordering it, right? He's establishing the structure and order of the universe. John Walton goes through this. If you want to read about this at a lay level, John Walton goes through this in his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1. It's not really about creation ex nihilo. And that's important because this establishes the idea for us that Genesis 1 is about God establishing an ordered realm out of chaos. That's what it's about. God's taking the pre-state of the universe, which is chaos, and turning it into order. And why do the Hebrews see it this way? Well, they see it this way because those two opposites are just the reality. You either have order or you have chaos. There's no like existential like if you were to sit down with an ancient Hebrew and talk to them and say, you know what nothing is? They'd be like, nothing. What do you mean? Nothing. And you'd be like, not a thing. A thing that's not a thing. It's nothing. And they'd be like, that what? No, like we just call that chaos. We call that disorder. Like a thing that is unordered is all we have a concept.
Yeah, so when something is created, it is the potential, the chaos being ordered into a thing, into a form, you could say. Not to use philosophical terms the wrong way.
Form would be too...
You know that I would.
Yeah, form would be too modern. Yeah, they're not concerned with matter. They're not concerned with objects. They're concerned with what a thing does. So God, the function, right? It's about function. This is what John Walton puts forward in the book. Is it's about function, and not about like material creation, right? But it's about function. So God may have indeed had things like the sun and other things like just sort of there in an unordered state, and then he took them and he placed them in their functional role. And that's what Genesis 1 is about, ultimately.
Which would help explain, for me, I think, why you couldn't say a thing that is not a thing. Because if it's function over form, a thing that is not a thing is an entity without function. Right. And an entity without function is just chaos. It's something not acting within any form of order.
Or system, yeah, definitely. And that's how they thought about creation. That's how all the ancients thought about creation. That's why, like, before there's gods for the Egyptians, there's just unordered chaos, and then the gods arise out of that and themselves function as the thing which brings order, right? So in Egypt, if you look at, and I have this in the notes for everyone, there's a picture of Egyptian iconography where the earth, the sky, all the things in it, each one of those things is a god. So before the gods, there was no order. There was just this chaos. And that's the Egyptian view. But the Israelite view is that God just always was. And yet, when we get to Genesis 1, what we're seeing is God approaching the unordered and making it ordered, the unfunctional and making it functional. With what purpose? Right? Well, the purpose is all to serve humankind, right? All of creation, like the center of Genesis 1 is the creation of mankind. All of creation has been created so mankind can exist in an ordered realm and can like have an ordered existence. That's why God made all this stuff for humans, right? And that's Genesis 1. We go from Genesis 1, and what's really weird is we jump into the rest of the Old Testament, and you're going to find, and here's what we're going to find today. We're going to find that like Genesis 1 describes it in a certain way, but then other Hebrew writers will use mythopoetic language of the cultures that surround them to describe creation in a completely different way. So where Genesis 1 demythologizes, the rest of the scriptures almost like re-mythologize and use the mythology from the surrounding cultures. So,
well, this is one of the pieces of evidence that Genesis 1 is actually relatively young as far as an Old Testament text, certainly younger than Genesis 2 through 4. A lot of the stories of the Old Testament likely existed much longer as oral traditions, going back tens of thousands of years even, in relatively unchanged forms, and then Genesis 1 as a competing story that kind of just like, our God is so strong, he doesn't even need to beat a monster because he created the monsters.
Funny enough, one of the words we're going to be seeing a lot today, tanin, which is a word for serpent or dragon. It appears in Genesis 1, but guess where it appears in Genesis 1? Tanin appears when it says that, and he created all the sea monsters, all the tanin, Genesis 1:21. So the sea monster, the great enemy of order and all this, the great chaos monster, God created it, which, by the way, is the very same thing that Job does. When God approaches Job in the whirlwind, what does he say to Job? He doesn't say like, hey, see these scary chaos monsters, how like bad and evil they are? Isn't this great that I'm going to like defeat them? No, God comes along to Job and says, check out Leviathan and Behemoth. These are good creations that I made that serve a purpose. That's what he says about them in Job, essentially, is they're good creations. Job and Genesis seem to just be of the impression that the Tanin, the Leviathan, the Behemoth, these chaos monsters are just good creations of God, at least initially. Unlike the other ancient Near Eastern cultures, which saw these as primordial forces which pre-existed. In some cases, the Tanin, the Leviathan, or Lotan as it's called in other cultures, pre-existed even the gods. you can see how different we already are. And it's important to set up this contrast at the beginning of this episode, because we are in a totally different mindset here, just starting out, than like where we were when we were looking at all of the stuff from the ancient Near East last episode.
I mean, like I said before, I had the impression of essentially Genesis 1 being, as you mentioned, creation ex nihilo, using word to bring order. And now we're already at only a few minutes in, we're already discussing not only is, say, Genesis 1 a different form of creation, but like this creation of the primordial chaos monsters is littered throughout the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, and still very much are a Jewish tradition, really. That it's not a Genesis 1 didn't overwrite them, it developed them.
Right, we can't say how early, like, it's really hard to say how early Genesis 1 is comparatively to other ancient Near Eastern literature. But even if it's not older than some of the oldest, right? So, in case you're not aware, like, the Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest pieces of literature in the world, right? Especially in the ancient Near East, but of the whole world. And then there's some other Babylonian literature that's older than Genesis as well. But at the bare minimum, what we can say about Genesis is interacting with this literature in a polemical sense. It's saying, you see how all that, how you said all that stuff works? Well, this is how it really works. And an ancient Near Eastern person reading Genesis 1 and reading Job is going to know, they're going to pick up on all the key terms. And then they're going to be shocked at what Genesis has to say, right? Because Genesis is saying something completely different from what they're used to. But it's using all the same language and literary terms and theological ideas that they're used to. But it's transforming them and speaking about them in a way that's totally unfamiliar. So, and this is what God does. God takes the familiar. He takes the thing that's familiar to people and he transforms it in a way that is unfamiliar. I like to talk here about where Jesus says, or actually, sorry, it's the prophets, it's Isaiah. It's like he's talking about what's going to happen when the Messiah comes. And he says that the low places will be made high and the high places will be made low. Take your expectations, throw them in the garbage can, because you don't even know what to expect when it comes to what God is going to do, right? And that's kind of the feel that I want you guys to have jumping into this.
I kind of see three possible perspectives that you can have about everything that we just discussed. In the recap, I think there's three views. You either view that kind of like the Genesis story, what is happening, the description of life and all this. You can view this as just another mythos, which I think is option one. I don't like that one. Most of us don't. Or that it is kind of like a capturing of, we see you have a mythos here, and we're going to then input it into, God is going to use your mythos and then show that he has dominion over it, which is kind of like the Christianity in response almost. Or the third option, which is the Bible is the first story, right? And after the Tower of Babel, everybody has that same story and it changes, but it's the same story, right? God has it first, right? It's his story. And then other mythos are just telling that in different ways. And I think those are the three perspectives I can think of that are worth kind of like, where do you land? Malin, I almost know your answer is going to go like, I think why not all three?
I have a fourth. Yeah, I have a fourth.
Come on, tell me. Fourth one. Okay, I'm ready. I thought hard on this.
Yeah, no, and I've thought about it too, because a lot of my research is into the grand biblical narrative, right? This is my like baby child. I love this stuff, right? What we're talking about right now is like one of my most favorite things on the planet. You know, the grand narrative of the Bible, and what is that, and how does it react, and how is it in response? Is it original? What is it? You know, I think the fourth possible solution here is to say, yes, it is God's story. However, God purposely condescends to a human level to tell that story, and in condescending to that human level, he uses language and terminology that is stock and barrel to the day that he's communicating within in order to communicate his true story. And then one of the other things we can say in addition is that maybe some of that language, probably a good portion of it, originated from before the Tower of Babel, from God himself anyways, and that's how it spread to the rest of the world. So we can have a sort of dual view, and I think it's right to say both of these things. I think it's right to say that a lot of the language does originate from God himself, but some of it doesn't. Some of it is from the culture of the day. Like, a good example of this is you see different visions of the throne room of God in the Bible. This is just a small example of this. And in these two different visions, one of them clearly is using Egyptian like iconography, and the other one is using like Mesopotamian iconography in its description of the throne room vision. You have to struggle with that and say, clearly, these people who were living in this time would have been more aware of what they were seeing if they saw Egyptian type stuff. And then this group of people would have known more what they were seeing if they saw Mesopotamian type stuff. And God just like is a smart communicator who can communicate his truth through any means he needs to. While at the same time, we can say, hey, there's probably some of that. There's probably antecedents to both the Mesopotamian and Egyptian stuff that originate from God. But God's totally cool with using other cultures' stuff to communicate his truth. Right. And so I think that's the fourth option in this perspective. Yeah.
It's almost like a mixture of two. As the ancient Spaniards used to say, "Por qué los dos," which means why not both?
Exactly. Why not both?
There's a teaching in, I know, the Orthodox Church, I think the Catholic Church as well, of basically history being a catechism of the human race, and that you start from the simple and naturalistic and intuitive, and you build upon that until you reach the fullness of Christianity and Hellenistic philosophy that has been corrected and interpreted through Christian lenses. And it seems to me that you could say the same thing is happening here to these myths, that we talked last time about how fully encompassing of not only the current life, but especially the ancient life, this Chaoskampf thing was, that your cycle from spring to winter and back. And you can still see it in the liturgical calendar. How intuitive this would have been to an ancient person. And then you build on that with, and our God created these cycles and all of these symbols and all of these beasts that you're seeing.
The reason it's so intuitive is because, and the reason it's so hard for modern people to grasp what we're talking about, is because in the modern world, religion and secular life, so to speak, are like two separate things. There are these two worlds that aren't really connected with each other, but have like a degree of separation. Everybody, I think, in the Western world experiences that degree of separation. Mm-hmm. But for the ancient person, there was no secular and religious life that were like separated from each other. They were one and the same thing. There wasn't this separation. That separation, comes out of the Enlightenment. That's not something that existed in the ancient world. And so for the ancient person, it's intuitive to have your religious calendrical cycle tied to the calendrical cycle for like when your crops are growing, because like the spiritual and the physical are intimately connected in that kind of worldview. We're not dualists. We're not like these people who say that only the spiritual world matters and the physical world doesn't matter at all. No. The ancient people like saw the spiritual and the physical being intimately connected with one another. And that's why this made sense for them. I mean, this dovetails nicely, though, a little bit into the first thing that I wanted to talk about with you guys. We haven't even really got to the first point. Let's see how that works.
Yeah, welcome get to the beginning of this recording.
Right. Yeah. No. What I want to talk about first, I just want to jump straight into the deep end of this topic. So Psalm 74, 13 and 14, we're going to read it. So it says, "You split the sea," Hebrew Ya'am, "by your strength, and smashed the sea serpents Tananim. You crushed the heads of Leviathan and let the desert animals eat him. There is the text of Psalm 74, 13 and 14. And then what I want to do immediately is contrast it to what we call the Ugaritic text, which is as we learned last week, the Canaanite text. So this would be from the Ugaritic textbook 1.3, tablet 3, lines 38 and 40 through 42. Pay very close attention to the similarity in language here. Didn't I demolish El's darling? See, Ya'am. Didn't I finish off the divine river, Rabim? Didn't I snare the dragon, Tanin? I enveloped him. I demolished the twisting serpent, Lotan, which is equivalent to Leviathan, the monster of 7 heads.
7-headed dragon or beast that comes from the sea. No connection, I think, in scripture at all.
No connection.
No connection. Man, I'm just going to almost fall back on this every time. I'm going to go, is this the same story? Or number 4, kind of like, is it both? Of course it's both. Like, that could be the answer. Yeah. And but every time it's just as cool.
Oh, it's so cool. So in Psalm 74, so I want to read you a small quote from my Hebrew teacher, actually. This is the guy who I learned Hebrew from. No joke. Mark Furtado. Here's what he has to say about this. In Psalm 74, the God of Israel defeats 3 foes. The sea, Ya'am, the monster, the Tananim, the Leviathan, right? Who has multiple heads. And in the Ugaritic text, the goddess Anat defeats the same 3 foes in the exact same order. The sea, Ya'am, the dragon, the Tanin, and the Leviathan, Lotan, who also has multiple heads. The foes are symbols of the chaos that threatens a well-ordered life in the world. The affirmation of both texts is that the deity vanquishes these forces of chaos. The point of the psalm is that the God of Israel is the one who vanquishes chaos, not Anat, or any other ancient Near Eastern deity for that matter. So that's the end of the quote from Furtado. I think he encapsulates it perfectly. But I would say this, that we must remember in context here, if you read the psalm in context, pay close attention. This is creation theology. This is not talking about Exodus or anything else. This is talking about creation. You go back and you read the psalm from the beginning and you read it to the end, and it's talking about when he established the sun and the stars and the sky. And Justinian, do you see what I was saying earlier about how, wait a minute, like Genesis 1 demythologized, and now we're back here to having the defeat of the forces of chaos, so to speak, at creation.
We're bringing back I don't want to say alternate, but the non-logos form of creation in praise of the same God who we're saying did create the universe that way. There's something to analyze here.
Exactly. And that's the point, is we have to be wary here, because we can't say, we can't say the Bible contradicts itself, right? We're all Christians here. We don't think that. Nobody thinks that. It doesn't. So what's going on? Well, in my opinion, and the opinion of many, many people out there who've studied this, what we have here is the combat myth being employed to say that even though the Israelites don't think that God had to battle anything at creation at all the forces of chaos that these other people think that their deities defeated, it's actually our God who has the power over those forces and demolishes all of them. It also intentionally describes Yahweh in the language of the gods of the nations, i.e., it uses the exact language of Yahweh that's used of Baal in the Ugaritic texts, right? In the Ugaritic textbook 5.128, it's you could directly compare these two and say, yeah, they're using the exact language that's used of Baal of Yahweh here. And Baal, guess what? Who's Baal? Anyone tell me? He's the one who seduced the Israelites away from the worship of Yahweh. And so it's as if the psalmist is writing here and saying, hey, all you Israelites who've been seduced away by Baal, you realize it's Yahweh who does all the things that you think Baal was doing? There's no point in worshiping Baal. Come back and worship Yahweh, right? Like, that's kind of the point here.
In a way, this is almost a archaic prime mover argument of like, look at these beasts. Somebody had to create them too. It was our God who did that. God isn't just the one who defeated them, although he did that too. He created them in the first place.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. So the question is, how does this mythological section of the Chaoskampf motif, this is really important because like this mythological section that we have here, how does it fit into the psalm overall? Because remember, we said the psalm is about creation, but what else is it about? Well, this is a lament psalm, right? It's a lament about the destruction of the temple that recalls creation and calls on him to do something similar to what he did back then, again, in light of the destruction of the temple. And that's what this psalm is about. So how does this fit in? Well, I found a good quote by a guy named Graham J.L. Michael in the Southeastern Theological Review, Volume 10, who does a good job of laying out how this fits. Here's what he says. What this means for Psalm 74 is that in response to the enemy's defilement and destruction of the temple, the psalmist invokes the creation type scene, which recounts God's salvific work in his defeat of the cosmic enemies and his establishment of the cosmic order. Verses 12 to 17. In this sense, the poetic employment of creation imagery is a fitting response to the devastation caused by the enemy. For these two sections of the poem are mutually informing. The violent actions described of the enemies against the temple and the land are understood in cosmic terms, in which God's sovereign rule is challenged, and the creation hymn is invoked to motivate God to respond and act within their current reality for his namesake as the king of old. As Green explains, the destruction of the temple, as described in the opening verses of Psalm 74, would then be an assault not simply on the physical building established for the worship of Yahweh, but on Yahweh's very sovereignty and the entirety of the created order as well. It makes perfect sense that the author of Psalm 74 would seek to connect creation imagery, the likes of which are found in Psalm 74, 12 to 17, to a lament over the destruction of the temple. The recollection of creation mythology, then, is a tacit call for Yahweh to rebuild the temple, as enthronement and the construction of a temple seem to be the ultimate results of the Chaoskampf events. Okay, that's the end of the quote. I think it's really important to pay attention to that last sentence especially. The recollection of creation mythology, specifically its purpose here in connecting it to Chaoskampf events, is that the ultimate result of Chaoskampf events is the rebuilding of the temple and the enthronement of the Lord. And this is a cosmic theme. Remember, the temple isn't like just a building, right? Like, it's not just a building where we go to worship God. It is a microcosm of the universe.
Something that caught my eye today, because I wanted to go through kind of like, what does scripture have to say about the sea, right? Because the sea is where these sea creatures and sea monsters dwell. In Revelation 21, the new heavens and new earth.
We're going to get there.
Oh, come on. What's not there, Raleigh? What's missing?
What's missing is we still need to get to a few passages which lead up to it, right?
Come on, I'm thirsty.
We're gonna get there. You're gonna sate that drink. We just need to drive a little bit further into the Old Testament before we can jump into the New, right?
So, okay, then can I ask you, because this is an interesting question, because to kind of get to the root of it, maybe you have an answer, because I haven't been able to find one. Why is it that the sea holds these creatures? I know it doesn't hold all of these creatures, right? We have remnants of kind of like a bird and the behemoth, right? It's in like Zul and the behemoth, these other large creatures.
Right.
Why is it, though, that the sea seems to be...
It's the sea and the wilderness.
Right. Yes, yeah, absolutely. The wilderness, you can see that everywhere. Nobody likes the wilderness. Everybody hates the wilderness.
Tohu wabohu. Genesis 1. We're going back to that real quick. Tohu wabohu holds the key to the answer to your question. Tohu wabohu is the word that's used. Like it's usually translated formless and void. I hate that translation. I don't think it's a good one. I like Robert Alter's translation more because it captures the force of it. Welter and waste. In the beginning, the earth was welter and waste. Why is that a better translation? Well, because when you look at where Tohu reappears, for one, wabohu is just an alliteration term. Like it was wholly invented by the author of Genesis 1. Like it's not a word on its own. It's an alliteration term for tohu. It's a special kind of like Hebrew way of doing alliteration. But tohu wabohu basically means, when you look at it throughout the rest of the Old Testament, tohu specifically reappears in referring to a trackless desert, a wasteland. When you see that, and then you go back to Genesis 1, you go, oh, right. What we said in the beginning of this episode about why is water the image? Why is a trackless desert the image? Because these are places where humans can't live. These are places that don't have order enough to them to where a human could exist within them. When God describes the desolation of Israel after the exile, the way he describes it is that the land became tohu, right? Right? It became like just devoid of all life. Things couldn't grow there. Things didn't live there anymore. Animals didn't eat things there. Like it was just a wasteland. Now so
as far as the ancient Hebrews could tell, it was a place with no function.
With no function. It was functionless.
Pure chaos.
Pure chaos. And that's why water, specifically the ocean, is seen as chaos. Because there's no function there. It's just like there's crazy storms. A sailor can go out there and he can just die.
I'm going to recap Psalm 74 real quick. It's a lament, and it's opening with, why have you rejected us?
Why have you let the ruin happen?
And then praise and restatement of creation. You brought all of this. You have all of this power. Remember how our enemy is disrespecting you and mocking you. Hear our prayers. Bring order back.
Right. So I'll go back just real quick because I wanted to continue on from that. So again, the point is the destruction of the temple is not just the destruction of some physical building. It's a taunt to Yahweh's very sovereignty over creation. And it's an example of like, well, maybe the created order itself is at risk. If the temple can be destroyed and the temple is a microcosm of creation, then maybe we're going to lose created order, right? And so that's the fear, and
that's an understandable fear,
right? Yeah, exactly. When you understand it in the way they did, it's definitely understandable. Now, here's an even more specific thing. It's like, what are the ultimate results normally of Chaoskampf events? Well, let's go back to where we were when we were talking about the Chaoskampf events in ancient Near East. What we see is the Chaoskampf events normally end with the enthronement of a king and the re-establishment of created order through the re-establishment of the temple cultus and the re-establishment of the king's rule and all that kind of stuff. This is how Chaoskampf events the normal ending of them is. It's like the Chaoskampf event happens, and then like the king comes in and defeats the order, the chaos forces, and reestablishes order. That's what's expected. So that's what they're calling to Yahweh for. Now, Frank Lothar Hosfield and Eric Zegner in the Hermania commentary also pointed something else out that like really caught my attention, which further expands what I just said. This psalm uses a foundational principle of Yahweh's tie to Israel and the whole world, which is a theme throughout the whole Hebrew Bible. And this is, as verse 12 of the psalm says, "Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth." The fact that God works salvation in the midst of the earth, no matter what is happening with any individual location or place, like all of the temple stuff we're talking about, is affirmed throughout the preceding verses. but not simply is it affirmed, but it's defined. The how is shown. How God works salvation in the midst of the earth is in verse 13, that he defeats the forces of chaos and brings order from the conflict. So this is a big deal, right? Because what we're talking about now is salvation, right?
The defeat of death, the ultimate return to chaos. We're talking about Christ defeating that and bringing permanent order to creation.
Right. So the psalm tells us how God does that, right? The psalm says, God is my king from of old, and he works salvation in the midst of the earth. And then it tells us how he does that. How does God work salvation in the midst of the earth? By defeating the forces of chaos. That's how. This is now a principle upon which you can base an understanding of how God does salvific work. And I say that with firm certainty, because if we go and look in the Old Testament elsewhere, we're going to find that that's the case all over the place. God defeating the forces of chaos, leading his people through the chaos and to a new order. So this is what we see consistently in the Old Testament all the time. I mean, go to the Exodus story. That's basically what the Exodus story is. God taking his people, saying, I'm the true God, defeating the forces of chaos, i.e. the gods of Egypt, and bringing chaos to them. And through that, then creating something new, a new people, which get led through the chaos, the waters on their right and on their left, when they're walking through the Red Sea, and get brought to a new order, given the law. And that's the primal salvation event in the Old Testament. Like, you want to talk about what salvation means in the Old Testament? That's it, the Exodus. And the Exodus follows this pattern that the Psalm sets out here, that God works salvation in the midst of the earth through defeating chaos and establishing an order out of that. How crazy is that? So now we've from Chaoskampf, we've come to a realization of how God works salvation, right? And we're going to continue to follow that in this discussion. We're going to continue to follow that. But before we go to the next section, I want to kind of get your guys' thoughts on that.
I mean, this is giving me a new appreciation for certain things that I've seen in the Old Testament, that you read this without all of the context, and it's just a paragraph of praise in the midst of a lament, and that's really all you would take from it. But now it's like this is another prelude to Christ in something that doesn't even remotely look like it to the naked eye.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Right. It definitely... I was telling somebody about this topic today, and I was like, before you learn it, you don't think you're missing anything. But once you know it, you see it everywhere.
Oh,
you can't not miss it. It hits everything. It's one of those things like, you're doing a good job interpreting the Old Testament when you notice that it's pointing towards Christ.
Right.
That's asterisk there, because there can be abuses to that.
There can be.
But and it's the same thing with this, because this likewise, like, this is just, as you said, like another prelude, another layer pointing towards Christ. And what really blows my mind is that God, when forming, this is back to what Raleigh told me, I think 2 days ago, about how, like, nations being almost this replacement of the sea. And every time that God interacts with the nations, it's not just as if he does play the form of chaos, right? When it's punishment, whether it's captivity, Babylon, whether it's
the flood,
whether it's
just on, like, creation, it's
right, all on creation. Oh, whether he plays it towards Pharaoh, like, he plays this chaos to bring chaos to be the order. He builds this necessity of himself, which is right. Like, to me, that's just like I just go, wow. Like, it's not just like God's part of this. It's like, this is God.
And Genesis 1 is foundational to it all.
Right.
God creates order out of chaos. That's what Genesis 1 is saying. And if you hear it correctly, you'll see it in the rest of the Old Testament.
There's this principle to Christianity that the universe would basically cease to be if not for God's constant intervention, his constant action upon it. And I'm probably formulating that incorrectly.
He upholds everything by the might of his word. Sure. Right, is I think what it says in the New Testament.
It sits in his hands. Right. He's outstretched the heavens. Every time he can withdraw just a little bit of that action, or maybe cause it to be different, chaos ensues and returns.
And that's what judgment forms. I want you guys to hear this. That's what God's judgment is. God's judgment isn't him doing something to people. It's him removing himself and allowing chaos to happen. That's the picture of God's judgment throughout the entire Old Testament. God removes himself, he removes his holding back of the waters, and the flood happens.
When people forget God, when the nations forget God, it's not God striking them down, it's that, well, if you forget me, then you're off to your own devices. And look what happens.
That's exactly it. And that's what exile is. Exile is saying, well, humanity was meant to exist in God's grace. But now when we get exiled from God's grace, look what happens, right? Look what we do. Look what we become. We're never meant to exist like this, but now we are. And the more we get removed, the further and further removed from that we get, the worse and worse it gets. But God, throughout the whole Old Testament, continually pursues humanity, even though humanity is getting further and further away in many respects. But there does come a point, and this is what the flood teaches us, there does come a point, if God doesn't do something, humanity is going to digress to a point where there is no return. They will just be in a state of perpetual chaos forever if God does not intervene graciously. And that's exactly what he does. The flood is not God being angry and killing people. The flood is God saying, dude, if I let you guys keep going with this, you're all going to be dead and the whole world is going to be destroyed.
Chaos embodied by the literal sea rises up and consumes everything.
So God allows the chaos to consume them so that he might, through chaos, make a new creation. Just like he did in Genesis 1. Through the waters of chaos, God baptized the earth, so to speak, and made a new creation that was cleansed and ready for a new Adam, Noah, and his family to take over. And that pattern continues throughout the Old Testament. It's a pattern that keeps going. But what I want to do...
It doesn't just continue through the Old Testament.
That's right.
Continuing to today.
But I'm trying to stick in the Old Testament for now. Because what I want to do is I want to take you next to Isaiah 27:1. This is the next big passage. And I'm going to read a custom translation again. In that day, Yahweh, with his fierce, mighty, and powerful sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeting serpent, Nahash. Leviathan, the twisting or coiling serpent, Nahash. He will kill the dragon, Tanin, that is in the sea. So there's our Isaiah 27:1 passage. Now I'm going to read you, again, we're going to go back to the Ugaritic text, and it's the Ugaritic text 67:1, line 1 through 4. Though you smote Latan, the twisting serpent, finished off the writhing serpent, encircler with 7 heads. When I tear you in pieces, I shall devour your elbows, blood, and forearms. You will indeed go down into the throat of divine Ma'at. Ma'at is like the realm of death, or Ma'at is the god specifically of death, but it's also the realm of death. Do you guys notice the similarity?
No, absolutely nothing in common.
No similarity whatsoever here. Right. So you have the twisting serpent, the fleeting serpent, the coiling serpent, the Tanin that is in the sea. All 3 of these are described. They're all the same being, by the way. And how interesting that the word for serpent here it's not using Leviathan only or Tanin only, but it uses Nahash, is the word that's used to describe the snake in Genesis 2 and 3. The Nahash that came to Adam and Eve. And so now we have a connection to Genesis 2 and 3, the Nahash. And how interesting, because cough, cough, Revelation will cough, cough. make this connection later.
Of course.
But this is super interesting. So, basically in scholarship, this section is part of what's known as the Isaiah apocalypse, right? That's what they call it, the Isaiah apocalypse. That's Isaiah chapters 24 to 27. This text has good textual linkage with Psalm 74, so much so that we can say that there might be some kind of echoing going on here. It uses the same creatures that were associated with the past divine victory over chaos to describe the future subjugation of chaos. Again, pay attention here. This is the day of the Lord. In the day of the Lord, God will punish the Leviathan, who is the fleeting serpent, the fleeting Nahash, the twisting Nahash, the dragon, the Tanin that is in the sea. We're again, God's salvific activity in the day of the Lord is being described in terms of the defeat of chaos and the forces of chaos. Once again, it's a repeat of what we just read in Psalm 74. Only this time it's in a apocalyptic type text, right? Instead of a psalm that's recalling creation. So it's kind of a big deal, right? Like, we're talking about a big thing here. Now, I want to read a quote from Robert S. Fayal in his book, Now My Eyes Have Seen You, Images of Creation and Evil in the Book of Job. And he writes about this in this book. I think he does a good job of it. He says, it would be interesting to trace this motif throughout Isaiah. Space permits only a brief reference to the smiting of the evil power. The king of Babylon brought down to Sheol in Isaiah 14:12 and following. The destruction of Sennacherib, an earthly manifestation of the evil power in chapter 37. The historical and eschatological smiting of Rahab, who is Egypt. Isaiah 51:9 and following. Leviathan here sums up all that is evil and opposed to God. No matter if it is earthly manifestation, is Assyria, Babylon, Edom, or any other power. Mortar comments, the picture of the power of the air, the coiling serpent on the ground, and the dragon which is in the sea, shows the whole creation is infested with alien powers which will be sought and destroyed wherever they exist. The eschatological nuances of that day complement and complete the creation theology of Leviathan in Job and the Psalter. The final smiting of the monster leads to the new creation that is the final answer to Job's agonies. So all this stuff ties together, right? That's the end of the quote. But all this stuff ties together, you see? I want you guys to be able to respond to that and sit with that for a second.
Garrett?
Are you?
I mean, well, it's one of those, like, when a man says it all, do you just say yes, I concur? Because I do, like, it's one of those things where Toots everywhere and how good and useful this kind of understanding of Scripture is, and how powerful it makes God.
Yeah.
I think that really does. It just adds kind of like that extra filter over the eyes of how to see the Lord. Like, you peer into his light a little bit better by understanding what he's doing and the purpose of all of it. We haven't even gotten into really in depth of like what this does for the nations.
Right. No, and we might not get there fully today, but
right.
It's really cool already, because we're like, the description we have in connection with Psalm 74 here, and in the total theology of the book of Isaiah itself in this respect. I like how he quotes Mortar, who says, we have a picture of the power of the air, we have the coiling serpent on the ground and the dragon that's in the sea, which shows that the whole creation has become infested with alien powers, which will be sought and destroyed wherever they are. And this is
Would I be jumping the gun to talk about Revelation at all yet?
We're going to get there. I'm so close to it. I know you want to
get there.
We're so close to it. I have one more Old Testament passage, and then we're at Revelation. I promise. The one more Old Testament passage I want to get to is Daniel 7. This is really important to talk about. We've got to talk about Daniel 7. If you don't know what's in Daniel 7, you should. I want everyone in this room to memorize Daniel 7 and what's in it. It's a great text that you should know. Daniel 7 is the Son of Man text in the Old Testament where the Son of Man comes to the throne of the Ancient of Days and receives the kingdom and dominion and power from him. And guess what else is in Daniel 7? The sea and the monsters that come out of it. And guess what these monsters so happen to be in Daniel 7 that are coming out of the sea? Human empires. Human empires, right? So we have human empires being described as the serpents that come out of the sea, so to speak, right? How perfect, right? Because what we're seeing here is then the connection between the forces of darkness and the forces of of chaos, and how they intertwine with humans, and how humans themselves become forces of chaos, right? So like there's a distinction made in Daniel 7 between the Son of Man, who's the human one, the truly human one, so to speak, and these forces of chaos, which themselves are human, but they've lost what it means to be human, right? And they're now forces of chaos, along with the Leviathan and whatnot, right? They are basically on that side of history, so to speak. And how interesting that, like, what you see in Daniel 7 is the Son of Man receiving the kingdom from the Ancient of Days, and then he's sharing it with his people. And then the final beast of the sea is defeated. So the Son of Man receives the kingdom, and all of his people through him receive the kingdom. And the beast, the final beast that's rampaging about, is defeated. I mean, are we talking about the cross, or are we talking about the cross? Like, what are we talking about here, right? Are we talking about the ascension of Jesus into heaven? I mean, this is what Jesus says.
Right. So I was actually thinking this earlier when we were going over Isaiah 27, whether that was thinking in aspects of, and again, the answer could be both here, and that's okay.
Yeah.
In Daniel 7, in Isaiah, is this talking about, it's hard to throw a chapter, and I don't want to throw a chapter. Is this like Jesus' victory? Or, I know you're going to say both, or is this like future apocalyptic end of the war thing? Because I know that it was within kind of like Jewish tradition that like in the end there was going to be this great battle, right? We've all seen the photo. It's
right.
It's there. If you Google God slaying the serpent in the ocean, it's black and white. It's beautiful. It's like, here's this Jewish tradition and this great battle happening in the future. And that sounds so much like this future apocalyptic event. But it also just sounds, not to say just is a diminishing, but like this can be answered by Christ's victory on the cross and his ascension to heaven, right?
Yeah. And you're right, it is both. And the reason why it's both, I'm gonna throw a fancy scholarly term out here, and then I'm gonna do a more down-to-earth version of it. Inaugurated eschatology. Right. I've said this before to you specifically, but inaugurated eschatology is basically the what was also called now and not yet theology. It's the idea the kingdom of God has arrived now, but not yet to its fullest extent. The forces of chaos have been defeated, but not yet completely. Both are true. This is what the New Testament puts forward. When you start really studying the New Testament in detail, you'll find the now and not yet theology is all over the place, or as we call it, inaugurated eschatology. That's a different subject for a different day, but it's important to know about it and to be informed of it. This is one of the reasons why I say that I'm not a big fan of systematic theology, because all these theological things just tie in together so well that, like, you've got to talk about 10 different things when you're talking about one thing, you know? But yeah, the idea with this, Garrett, is that Jesus' defeat on the cross of the powers was the event that was being talked about, and is the event that precipitates the final defeat of the powers. That's the idea. So it's both. And when you read the New Testament, it just becomes so clear. that this is how it's supposed to be understood. But we're going to get there a little bit closer. So let's jump to Revelation 13, right? So you had something you wanted to say on Revelation 13, Justinian. Did you want to say that now before I jump into it, or?
I think we both did. I am thinking now, the beast out of the sea, of course, the Revelations in general is hard. Anyone who says they understand it, I immediately distrust.
Right.
It's impossible to wrap your mind around, I think. But this chaos thing is making a whole lot more sense of it, because now the beast rising out of the sea and attaining dominion over the earth, that's just the chaos of humanity's sin building up to a crescendo now. And having complete power over everything.
The sea is humans in Revelation. Think about that for a second. Revelation interprets what the sea is. The sea is the nations. Just think about that for a second with what you just said. A crescendo of human chaos reaching its zenith, so to speak.
And I think that the scariest thing about that is that I can see that being a literal thing that happens way easier than a literal seven-headed dragon.
Right, so the seven-headed dragon...
Much more real.
Think about this for a second. How many heads did the dragon have in Ugaritic text? Yeah, he had 7 heads. Well, in the Old Testament, it just said many-headed dragon. It didn't tell us how many heads it had. But it seems as though the 7-headed idea that Revelation has comes from this shared mythology, so to speak, right? But here's the fun part. The 7-headed dragon in Revelation is like, imagine, Daniel's 4 beasts that rise out of the sea. Basically, what the author of Revelation has done is taken all 4 of those beasts and smashed them together into one beast, right? That's basically what he's done.
For all, just an added flavor here, the idea of the nations being the sea. If you read Isaiah 60 verse 5, it says, "Then you will see you will see and be radiant, and your heart will thrill and rejoice, because," and here's the parallel, "the abundance of the sea will be turned to you. The wealth of the nations will come to you."
How perfect.
So there's a direct parallel of the nations and the sea in the Old Testament as well.
That's perfect.
There you go. I figured, here's a nice flavor. Here, I know this. I read this today.
I love it. Thank you so much for that. I didn't have that in my notes. That's a great one. Yeah, that says it perfectly. The nations are the sea. Why? Because they're in exile from God. They're in chaos, and they have reached a point where they are just in complete, utter chaos. To the point now where, you have the serpent ruling over them. This serpent is fully in complete and utter control.
And there's also the beast out of the earth in Revelation 13, right? And we talked about that briefly, that it's not just the sea that is pure chaos, but any wilderness that has no function to human purposes would be chaotic. And now we've got the sea beast, which is the more prominent one, but also the beast coming out of the earth as well.
Yeah, so if we tie all this stuff together, Isaiah, Daniel, Revelation, the Psalter, what are we saying? We're saying that the way that God works salvation in the midst of the earth, as the psalm says, is through the defeat of the powers of chaos. The ending of Chaoskampf, finally and fully through the day of the Lord, the Son of Man, and the sea being, wait for it, no more. Right? As we have at the end in Revelation 21.
Like you stole my line.
I did.
You stole my tagline.
I totally stole it.
That's okay. I'm okay with it.
I'm sorry.
No, I mean, that's it. I love it. At the end, right? The new heavens and the earth, and no more sea.
No more sea.
Very clear. 21:1. And
no more chaos.
Right. The sea is thrown into the lake of fire, which do what you want with that. But
check this out. Now that we have all this information, I want to do something really fun with you guys. We're going to go back to Genesis chapter 3, right? We can go from Revelation all the way back to Genesis 3 and reread the story a little bit, right? So you guys both know what's called the Proto-Evangelium. I might be saying it a little bit incorrectly,
right?
But
right.
So the Proto-Evangelium is where God talks about what will happen with the seed of the woman and the serpent, right? And he talks about the serpent's head being crushed. Okay, wait a minute. Isn't that what we read in Isaiah 27? And
It is.
Isn't that what we read in Revelation? And isn't that what happens in the Gospels? Like,
right.
Yeah, exactly. God's redemption, the very first text, if you understand Chaoskampf well, right? The gospel, right? What all Christians, I don't know any Christian who doesn't say that, that text is the proto-evangelium, right? So now what I'm saying, and this is going to be a challenge for people, the only and proper way to truly understand the gospel fully is if you have Chaoskampf theology, right? Because Chaoskampf theology has shown us that how does God work salvation in the midst of the earth? I'll tell you how. Through defeating the forces of chaos themselves for us, so that we are not controlled and ruled by them anymore. I want to read something to you guys from Irenaeus now, okay? Because I think Irenaeus puts this beautifully, right? He ties all these kind of lines together in many ways, way back in the 2nd century, right? And I know you'll like this, Justinian, very much, right? Here's what Irenaeus says. He has, therefore, in his work of recapitulation, summed up all things, both waging war against our enemy and crushing him who had at the beginning led us away as captives in Adam, and trampled upon his head, as thou canst perceive in Genesis, that God said to the serpent, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and he shall be on the watch for thy head, and thou shalt be on the watch for his heel. For from that time, he who should be born of a woman, namely from the virgin, after the likeness of Adam, was preached as keeping watch for the head of the serpent. This is the seed of which the apostle says in the epistle to the Galatians that the law of works was established until the seed should come, to whom the promise was made. This fact is exhibited in still a clearer light in the same epistle, where he thus speaks. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman. For indeed the enemy would not have been fairly vanquished unless it had been a man born of a woman who conquered him. For it was by means of a woman that he got the advantage over man at first, setting himself up as man's opponent. And therefore does the Lord profess himself to be the Son of Man, compromising in himself that original man out of whom the woman was fashioned, in order that, as our species went down to death through a vanquished man, so we may ascend to life again through a victorious one. And as through a man death received the palm of victory against us, so again by a man we may receive the palm against death. How beautiful, right? Isn't that great?
Yeah, but what does that guy know? No, I'm kidding.
So there you go. There's your New Testament. There's your tie-in to the New Testament.
Right.
There's how the story of Jesus ties into all of this. Irenaeus just did a great job he did my job for me, basically, at showing you how the New Testament ties into all this stuff we've been talking about, right? What did you think of that quote after understanding Chaoskampf theology, Justinian? I'm interested in your thoughts.
And this whole thing is one of the most mind-blowing new angles of looking at the Bible that I've had. I mean, I've had this is the third major instant of something that I'd call it a discovery, but we're not the first people to come up with it.
Definitely.
Just forces me, it makes me want to go reread stuff with this new information in mind.
Yeah. And that's what the Bible is meant to be. The Bible is meant to be meditation literature that you go and you read and reread, and on every reread, the information that you got from the last read, you read it with that in mind. So I would hope that you would do that. That's a very good tack to take, because you're going to notice it's going to yell at you right off the pages of Scripture. And for that matter, it'll yell at you if you read Second Temple Jewish literature, if you read any like the Deuterocanon, if you read like even church fathers, like they saw this theme too, and they write about it in multiple locations. How does God work salvation in the earth? Through the defeat of chaos, through the defeat of the forces of chaos, so that we might be redeemed in the same way that we fell, through a man who, instead of being defeated by the forces of chaos, himself defeats the forces of chaos, right? And in fact, the interesting thing is the central act of God working salvation in the midst of the earth in the Old Testament can and must be understood in terms of the combat motif. In fact, in the middle of the central salvation event, the Exodus, what does it say? God is a man of war. Wait, what is he? A man of war? Huh. Interesting. Right. What a perfect way to talk about what Jesus was doing in the Gospels. Right. Now, guess what you have? You have a perfect way to read the Gospels and understand, because here's the thing. Most people, when they read the Gospels, they don't read them and they see all the stuff Jesus does as just secondary, right? Oh, well, he's casting demons out of people. He's healing blind people. How great is Jesus? Isn't it cool that he can do this stuff? Right? That's the level of detail that people get out of it in a lot of cases. But with Chaoskampf, you're like, no, dude, he's declaring war on the forces of chaos, and he's defeating them, and he's winning the victory, and
binding him in a house and
binding the strong
taking
man.
Charge, yeah.
That's another big part of it, the binding of the strong man.
Yeah.
Passage.
In a much more direct way, pulling humans back into the realm of order too.
Yes.
Where before it's God withdraws his hand from the nations and they're all chaotic, and then when he restores order more indirectly through prophets and interacting with people. But then with Christ, he is on earth personally engaging with individuals to pull them back from chaos into the realm of order.
All I can think of right now, for some reason, is Thanos when he grabs the Infinity Gauntlet and says, "I'll do it myself."
I'll do it myself. So okay, something right when so today I was reading through Exodus again and Deuteronomy, and there's, not to get off crazy topic or whatever, but I was thinking of just how sovereign, how powerful, how glorious is God. And I know we usually think beam of light, invisible, you can't see him. He can't be seen, he's invisible. But when he shows up on the mountain, he lights the mountain on fire. He's like, let me show up. The mountain ignites, it quakes, and then his voice is thunder. And I don't know why I had always asked the question, why do they think that Moses is dead up there? Well, the mountain is on fire. They're he goes up there and they're like, wow, he's been gone for a while. This is terrifying. We were even told if we get close to the mountain, we die. Moses is dead.
Yeah.
And it makes sense when you think of it's not this all peaceful and it's just Moses and then God shows up and it's fine. No, the mountain catches on fire. And it's when I thought, I was just reading that today and I said, just how cool is it that he descends and the world just ignites?
Yep.
I was reading today to read it back around. I found it interesting that most of the time that God, that the sea subsides, it's always that he rebukes the waters.
Jesus does that in Jesus does that in the New Testament. And he rebukes the sea.
waters, right?
Yeah.
He rebukes the sea.
Which, by
It's
the
not
way,
like, yes.
by the way, do you know what that hints at? Demonic forces.
Right.
Like the sea isn't just like going crazy all on its own. No, it's demons.
Right.
That are
He also literally steps on it and puts it under his feet.
Yes.
He walks on the surface of chaos.
Job,
and
you know what's funny
makes
about
it
that?
function for him.
You know what's funny about that? Job, there's an intertextual connection between the Septuagint of Job and that text where Jesus is walking on the sea. And it's actually like a God ordering chaos type text as well. One of the parts of it is like the fact that, you know how the disciples in that, like it says that Jesus intended to pass by them on the boat. You know that, you know where it says that? It's very, you know, you blink, you miss it kind of thing.
Right.
But the connection to Job informs us that, like, well, no, this has deep meaning. And the meaning that it has is that, like, he intended to pass by them is the fact that they don't understand who he really is.
Right.
Right. And his nature, like, they don't see it. It's not revealed to them.
Sure.
At this point. And they're still not sure who he is. Right? They thought he was a ghost. And the same thing is true of the Job intertextual connection with that passage. So it's pretty cool. Like he controls the chaos. He is, you know, walking upon it, and it's like they still don't know who this guy is, right?
It's just to add a layer, it's even more than just, it's more than him walking on the water. He invites us out onto the water, right? Yeah. He invites us onto this victory.
Yes.
He doesn't just take the victory alone. He does. But we're invited to this.
The cross
and most, is like Peter.
The cross is at its heart, not a legal statement, but at its heart, it's an invitation to life with God in the victory over chaos. That's what it is.
And if I be lifted up, I draw all men unto me.
Yep. And it says, what does it say after that? It says, he said this to describe the death that he would die by. And what is the line before the if I be lifted up line? That the ruler of this world will soon be driven out. Right? And then it says, and I be lifted up to draw all men to myself. And he said this to describe the death by which he would die. Chaoskampf. That's it. He's dying to defeat the forces of chaos. When you don't have this in your theology, you miss all this stuff. Right. It just you don't even know it's there. You miss it.
Sure.
You know. But when you have it, the cross has so much more depth and complexity to it than we oftentimes care to give it, no matter where we come from in the Christian world. So you miss so much without it. But it's from beginning to end, this theology is central to the biblical story. And it's really important. We need to know it.
This is going to make me like immediately go reread the Gospels.
Yes, you should.
Reread the Bible, dude.
Yeah.
We just like you'll just see it, and you'll see it everywhere.
So what did we get today from this? We got another layer to soteriology, salvation theology, right? That's what I really wanted to pull out for you guys today, was just this idea that, like, soteriology is so much deeper than you could imagine, and Chaoskampf is like one layer of that, you know, and it really kind of lays a foundation for that. So God work salvation in the midst of the earth, right?
Very carefully and with great precision.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you, Raleigh. Thank you, Garrett, for joining us. We really appreciate your appearance and sharing all this information with us. Do you want to close with talking about your ministry again?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I have a ministry called Exegetical Research Group. We are a group, and we do exegetical research both on the Bible and on the church history as well. And we have a website, exrgm.com, and a Patreon. So if you like what you heard, feel free to go on our website, check out our Patreon, and support us. And check out all the stuff we're working on, because we're doing a lot of work, and we will soon have a YouTube channel. Probably by the time you post this podcast, officially, the YouTube channel will probably be up by that time. So check it out.